Salutations and welcome. I'm your host, Matthew DeSantis, and this is Amalfi Sports. And in this episode, Amalfi is headed to Elmont, not Belmont, Elmont, New York, for the Belmont Stakes, which is the third and final leg of horse racing's Triple Crown. Now, I appreciate everyone who turned into my Preakness Derby preview, or I should say Preakness Stakes preview. And if you did, then you might have actually made a little bit of money, because one of the horses that I was pretty high on was the long shot Rombauer, who ended up surprising most analysts by winning the Preakness Stakes. And more importantly, I even told you Rombauer and Midnight Bourbon might not be a bad exacta box. And guess what? Rombauer and Midnight Bourbon came in 1 and 2. So if you put an exacta box on those two, you actually would have made about $95 on a $2 bet. So maybe start listening to me a little bit more often. Got the rust off in the Kentucky Derby, where I was terrible, and starting to hit my stride now with the second leg of the Triple Crown. And now we're headed to the third and Belmont. Now, before we move to Belmont, which will be run this Saturday, June 5th at 6:49 p.m. Eastern Time, I want to spend a little bit of time recapping the Preakness, and then we'll shift to talking about the horses and the strategy for this weekend's Belmont Stakes. Now, as I said, let's start with what happened in Baltimore just a few weeks ago. It was another perfect day for racing at Pimlico, and we saw another upset. Just as Medina Spirit was an upset at the Kentucky Derby, so too now was Rombauer a big upset at actually around the same price, 12-1 at the Preakness. So Rombauer comes in first. Just to run down the order real quick for those of you who need a little bit of a refresher. Rombauer won. Coming in second was Midnight Bourbon. Coming in third was Derby winner Medina Spirit. Fourth was the horse Keep Me in Mind. Fifth was Crowded Trade. Sixth was Unbridled Honor. Seventh was France Go to Ina. 8 was Risk Taking. 9 was Concert Tour. That was a particularly disappointing finish for Concert Tour. And then 10th was the long shot Ram. It's interesting when you look back at this race. I watched this race a couple more times since it took place. And I think the one thing that I really came away from was, first of all, a lot of good horses, not a lot of great horses. And this is something I said after the Derby that I thought really played out in real time at the Preakness, that you saw a competitive race, a good race, an entertaining race. You saw some good performances from several different horses, not just Rombauer. I thought Midnight Bourbon had a really good performance. I even thought Medina Spirit, with everything going on around that horse, also had a really strong performance. Keep Me in Mind really improved a lot from the Derby as well. So some strong performances by the entire field, I thought, or by the upper half of that field. Also, posting some nice speed scores as well, which is, again, a little bit of an inside baseball number, but nonetheless, really effective. So a lot of good horses, but there was another horse that really blew me away. I'd also say that we're looking at Rombauer, and maybe this is a little bit of a forecast moving forward. Not surprising that the horse that won this race came from off the lead. It's a little bit easier to do at a shorter track. Remember, the Preakness is the shortest of all 3 Triple Crown races, being only 1 mile and 3/16. It's a little bit easier for 2 reasons. One, there was quite literally half the amount of horses in the Preakness as there was in the Derby. There were 20 horses in the Derby. There were only 10 in the Preakness. So it's easier to come from behind because there's fewer horses to navigate through. So oftentimes in the Kentucky Derby, you can see instances where horses just get boxed in, they get really pushed out wide, they have a really tough trip, and it's tough for them to make up that ground because there's so many horses to overcome. In a smaller field where you only have 10, a little bit easier to navigate around. It's easier to go from like 6th to 1st, that sort of thing. And so you don't have to be quite as close up. You're not going to be boxed in. It's a little bit more free flowing. The other thing is it's a shorter track, and typically shorter distances are when you can see horses come from behind. I'm not talking about quarter horses, obviously. Those are very short races, and that's a little bit of a different animal, so to speak. Not literally, but figuratively. And but with shorter races compared to the Belmont, which we're going to talk about here in a second, it's not surprising to see horses coming from behind because they have a little bit more gas, so to speak, in the tank. And it's easier to ratchet up that last little burst to make it past your opponent in a shorter race. Think about it practically. If you were running a marathon and you were asked to kind of go full out that last 2/10 of a mile, 26.2 miles, you've just gone 26. Now that last 2/10, let's say you really have to sprint, you're not going to have a lot left in the tank to really go sprint. So it's tough to come from behind when you're running a longer race. Whereas if you're only running, let's say, the 800 meters, it's a little bit easier to have extra gear, a little bit more gas in your tank for that final stretch run because you haven't expended so much energy. And that's kind of what we see. So, not surprising, perhaps, that we saw a horse like Rombauer come from off the lead to win the Preakness. You don't typically see wire to wire winners at the Preakness. That's a little bit unusual. So, again, great performance by Rombauer, though. Don't want to take anything away from the horse. Really improved those speed numbers and really demonstrated a pretty strong pedigree, I think. The other thing that I saw from the Preakness that you can take away is the difference a jockey can make. I highlighted it on that Preakness preview, but Irad Ortiz Jr. riding Midnight Bourbon, man, what a difference a jockey makes. Had a much better trip. And the thing was, it wasn't as if Midnight Bourbon had a bad trip necessarily at the Kentucky Derby, had roughly the same post position relative to the rest of the field, kind of broke in the middle, so to speak. I think he was post position, I want to say 10 or 11 at the Derby and was post position 5 at the Preakness. So again, relative to the rest of the field, broke in the middle and broke pretty cleanly. It was just the difference of having a jockey who knows how to navigate a horse and knows when to push a horse and when not to, when to hold back, and what was the critical importance of that strategic speed of getting out in front and getting close to the lead early. So you really saw, I thought, Midnight Bourbon run a really strong race, came back, finished second. Irad Ortiz Jr., very accomplished jockey who I'm very high on. Very impressive young jockey who, again, I think a lot of Americans probably don't know. But if you follow horse racing, he's one of those names that just pops off the screen and is really impressive. So I think those were two of the takeaways that I had from the Preakness. Now, obviously, the result of the Preakness with Rombauer winning means that there is no run for the Triple Crown because, of course, Medina Spirit won the Kentucky Derby and you finished third at the Preakness. So nobody's trying to run for the Triple Crown. Now, you'll have people debate, is that good or bad for the sport? And I think to some extent it's good because we've just had two Triple Crown winners in relatively recent years, American Pharaoh and then again Justified. I think that if you start having Triple Crowns too often, it becomes a little commonplace and people maybe lose the mystique behind the Triple Crown, even though we had a huge 30-year gap in between Triple Crown winners and that American Pharaoh finally broke. I also think it speaks to the depth in horse racing. As I mentioned, a lot of good horses, a lot of competitive horses, a lot of horses that could, win any given Saturday, I suppose, not any given Sunday, as the saying goes for football, but any given Saturday. I do think, though, there's an element that is, from a rating standpoint and from a public consciousness standpoint, it's probably bad that you don't have a run for the Triple Crown because that would have generated a lot more media buzz. Unfortunately, a lot of it probably would have been negative if Medina Spirit and Bob Baffert, who was the trainer, who, again, we'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. But, if Medina Spirit had won again, a lot of cloud of controversy around that horse and trainer. So would that have been good or bad for the sport? I'm not sure. But when there's a run for the Triple Crown, the casual fan gets excited, gets interested. And obviously, when you have two different horses win the first two legs and you don't have any kind of storylines going into the Belmont, it can fall a little flat. And the average American or the very casual horse racing watcher will probably tune out or just be less interested and less engaged. I do hope, though, it makes people realize there's a lot more horse racing than just the Triple Crown. The Triple Crown's great, but there's a whole set of races throughout the year. And again, we're getting introduced to these horses at the very beginning of their careers. These are 3-year-old thoroughbreds. there are a lot of other horses that run, not just 3-year-old thoroughbreds. So conflating horse racing to the Triple Crown, I think really does a disservice to just the multitude of different types of horses, different types of races. I've mentioned turf racing before on the podcast and on the videos, but again, that's a whole other kind of segment of races that people typically are not exposed to. Quarter horses, different length of a race that that you're used to. So 5 furlong races that can be just one turn. So basically they get the starting gate is on the back stretch, and they just run around that third and fourth turn and finish at the starting. Finish line at the grandstands. So I think that there's a lot of different types of horse racing out there. People who just think of it as race for the Triple Crowns, the Derby, the Preakness, the Belmont. There's a lot more than that, and I do hope that people realize that. And I think maybe not having a Triple Crown winner and not having a potential Triple Crown run maybe alerts people to that and lets them know there's a lot more to this sport than just these 3 races. But as I mentioned, the media coverage will be probably a little less significant. Certainly, there was a lot of popular media coverage around American Pharaoh and Justified when both of them made their runs successfully for the Triple Crown just a few years ago. So now let's pivot from talking about the Belmont or talking about the Preakness to talking about the Belmont. And unfortunately, one of the storylines that is still quite relevant for the Belmont is a holdover from the positive drug test that Medina Spirit had for betamethasone after the Kentucky Derby. That second sample has still not yet come back in terms of the results. Remember, the first sample tested positive for betamethasone, which is forbidden in the horse and prohibited substance. There was a second sample taken that same day. That second sample has yet to come back in terms of the test results. We'll see when it does come back. Everybody has said this would take multiple weeks to come out. So it's not surprising that it's taking this long, but just one of those issues that we confront, unfortunately, in horse racing. So the real big news, though, from that, aside from just waiting for the results from Medina Spirit, is that Hall of Fame trainer Bob Baffert has been banned from entering horses by the New York Racing Association. And he cannot enter any horses at any New York Racing Association racetracks. And that is a significant ban and certainly a very black eye on his legacy and his pocketbook as well. And now, while that might sound like a very punitive measure, considering we're still waiting for the second test result, as I mentioned in the last preview for the Preakness, this is not Baffert's first time having a horse test positive for betamethasone. And so this is a little bit of a repeat offender situation. Also, practically, this doesn't have as much of an impact on Baffert's horses as you might imagine, since Baffert is able to transfer his horses to one of his assistants, and his assistants can enter those horses at New York racetracks. So Baffert does not have any horses in the Belmont, but also none of his assistants do either. So, this was not an issue for the Belmont, but there's a lot of horse racing that goes on at Belmont Park and at Aqueduct and Saratoga and other racetracks throughout the state of New York. Baffert is still able to kind of technically enter horses by transferring training status to one of his assistants, and then the horse can enter that way. So there are some ways to circumnavigate the rules a little bit. And unfortunately, this is a little bit more commonplace than people realize in terms of banning trainers from entering horses if there have been positive drug tests. So as I said, though, I think the positive perhaps from that story is that with Medina Spirit losing the Preakness and not racing at the Belmont, I'm hopeful that there will be more spotlight on the horses that are here and that are racing at the Belmont, because that's what it really should be about. It should be about the horses that are racing. It should be about the jockeys and the trainers that are all following the rules and are trying to, have us enjoy this wonderful sport. So let's take a little look at Belmont, which is the third and the most grueling leg of horse racing's Triple Crown. So Belmont is a very special race in my eyes. I think it's always been the most enjoyable, actually, of the 3 Triple Crown races for me, because it's the most unique and the most distinct. Part of it too is the brashness of New York. I grew up outside of Philadelphia. I don't necessarily like New York that much, but I respect New York. And just even the song that the horses come out to. When you're at the Kentucky Derby, they come out to My Old Kentucky Home. And it's kind of this melodic, old timey song, My Old Kentucky Home. Dun, 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 dun. And then you go to Pimlico and it's Maryland, My Maryland, kind of the same thing. Nobody knows the words, but they go along with it. But it's the same sort of very almost a Stephen F. Foster kind of tune. Then you come to Belmont and the horses walk out of the paddock and they walk onto the track. And man, I love it because you just hear ba, 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 da, da, ba, 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 da, da, ba, 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 da, da, da. Start spreading the news. I'm leaving today. I want to be a part of it. New York, New York. You just hear Frank, baby. That's what it's all about. Frank Sinatra coming through with New York, New York. And it energizes the whole crowd. You see the New Yorkers and even those from New Jersey who kind of want to be New Yorkers, they're going nuts. They love it. And it's more of a rock star. It's more of a spectacle when that happens. It's funny when Old Kentucky Home and Maryland, My Maryland play, you can see people are kind of mouthing the words. It's a little bit like some church services that I've been to in my life where the pastor picks out a song that people maybe know the first verse but don't know the rest of the verses very well, and you kind of get to that third verse and you're just kind of like and you're kind of mouthing the lyrics a little bit, and you're not quite sure what's going on. Everybody knows the words to Frank's song. So you gotta love it when New York, New York comes on. But listen, it's a great scene for horse racing. And let's shift to talking about the Belmont race. And that's, again, a spectacle. It is really the test of champions in that it is a mile and a half. This is a distance that is much further than these horses have ever run before. A lot of them are not even bred to necessarily run this distance. And it's a distance that most of them will never run again. It is a distance that they will run one time in their careers, and that is at the Belmont. It is, like I said, tested champions. But certainly anyone who is a fan of the Belmont, fan of horse racing, one of the most indelible images, perhaps in the history of horse racing, is that of Secretariat winning the Belmont. And you just see Secretariat pulling out from all of the other horses and leaving everybody else in his wake as he pulls away through the backstretch and around the third and fourth turn and then down the front stretch where he's opened a 32 length lead over the next closest horse. And it was just such a tremendous victory for him. And I remember the call of, Secretariat by 6, Secretariat by 8. Secretariat is moving like a tremendous machine. And it just gives me chills still to even just repeat that. And there are some wonderful stories about this. One in particular that I always liked was Jack Nicklaus, the very famous golfer, told a sports writer this story later, but he called a sports writer over later that year and said, "You were at the Belmont, you saw Secretariat." And the sports writer said, "Yeah, I was there." And Jack said to him, I wasn't there. He goes, "I was in my living room watching alone. And when he crossed the finish line, I applauded and I cried." And the sports writer very astutely said, "Don't you understand, Jack? The reason you cried was because your entire career, you had been trying to achieve perfection. And at the end of the Belmont, you saw it. And that is still maybe the greatest performance in the history of horse racing. But that's the stage that you have at the Belmont, is to make that sort of indelible run and to leave those other horses in the wake and to prove the heart of a champion by going this much longer distance than these horses are ever asked to go and will ever be asked to go again." So an incredible performance and just an incredible racetrack. Now, that being said, there's some tactical issues here too, because it is a much longer race and Belmont has extraordinarily wide turns. And I've always heard people talk about it And I really didn't fully comprehend it until I went to Belmont Park. And I've been there in person, not for the Belmont Stakes, but I've been there to see other horse races. And you really do get a sense of how much longer those turns are, how much wider they are, how long they are in terms of how much ground they take up. It's a massive track, and those turns are so wide. Now, why do I keep harping on that, and why is that a big deal? It's a big deal because a lot of times a jockey will start to push a horse for the stretch run coming down somewhere between the third and fourth turn, or right before you get into that fourth turn. Well, at Belmont, you have those really long turns and those really wide turns. And I have seen it happen more than once where a jockey asks a horse to go way too early. He asks the horse to go, let's say, halfway through turns 3 and 4. You can do that at the Derby. You can do that at Pimlico, maybe. If you ask a horse to go halfway between the third and fourth turn at Belmont, you're not going to have a horse underneath you when you cross the finish line. You're going to wear the horse out because you're asking the horse to go way too early. So you just can't do it. So you have to be very careful. And that's why I'm going to talk about this a little bit when we discuss the individual horses. But you really do have to pay attention to jockeys that have experience at Belmont. That's such an important factor because they understand the way the track is shaped and when you have to ask your horse to go. And so that distance is not just navigating the distance, it's navigating the shape of the track as well. And that's a really important distinction to make. So, with all that being said, let's dive into the horses and let's talk a little bit about each one. And I will run through them by their post position, which was selected on Tuesday. And we will start with post position number 1 and the horse Bourbonic, which is going off right now at 15-1. I would imagine that number will actually go down a little bit. I would imagine this is probably closer to a 10-1 horse by the time the post time hits. And this horse is trained by Todd Pletcher, and the jockey is Kendrick Carmouche. Now, this is a horse that finished 13th at the Derby and then skipped the Preakness. This was a horse that won the Wood Memorial leading into the Kentucky Derby. Now, what I will say is absolutely nobody from that Wood Memorial has done particularly well in the Derby or the Preakness, which makes me think that Wood Memorial was a pretty crap race, to be honest, in terms of it really did not give us a good indication of how good these horses were relative to other horses that were being raced. To say, oh, well, they won the Wood Memorial, they won Santa Anita, they won the Louisiana Derby, they won the Bluegrass Stakes, etc. It just doesn't seem like that Wood Memorial field was particularly strong. And you've kind of seen that played out at both the Derby and the Preakness. The horse Bourbonic has had some success at about a mile. That's where he's won his races, is at that distance. So you do have some discussion of whether or not he's fit for a mile and a half. Now, on the positive, and you might say, is there any positives? There are some positives. One is he's trained by Todd Pletcher. Why is that important? Todd Pletcher has won the Belmont 3 times. He knows that track. He's won on that track. He's really, Belmont is kind of his home turf, his home track. He has a lot of horses there. So Pletcher knows the track well, has won the Belmont 3 times, and is someone who knows how to train horses for a longer distance. A lot of times when horses are trained, they'll run maybe 4 furlongs or 5 furlongs. Pletcher will run them 5 or 6 furlongs, but more importantly, he'll let the training riders run them out afterwards. In other words, they run 5 or 6 furlongs, but it's not as if they stop after that. He kind of lets them gallop it out a little bit longer. And so he gets this horses used to just running a little bit longer and being trained to run a little bit longer and being pushed to go a little bit longer. So he's got a good reputation there. I really like Pletcher horses at the Belmont, and just not just at the Belmont, but at longer tracks in general, longer races. So that's something to keep in mind that could work in favor of Bourbonic. Certainly the training regimen, it would be positive there. The other is his post position 1. Believe it or not, the first post position is the position that the highest number of winners from the Belmont Stakes have come from. 24 winners of the Belmont Stakes have come from post position 1. Now, that's quite a contradiction and quite the opposite from the Kentucky Derby. The Kentucky Derby, I remember I told you, almost nobody ever wins from the inside position. That it had been since 1960 since a horse won from the first post position at the Derby. Part of it is because there's just more horses at the Derby, and you can get kind of crunched in on that inside post position. At the Belmont this year, only 8 horses, so fewer horses in the field, not as much of a risk there. So, there are some things working in Bourbonic's favor, and I think those things will probably push his price down a little bit. I still don't love the horse, but he's not a bad flyer to take potentially, or to pair with on a trifecta box or something like that. So let's move to the number 2 horse, Essential Quality. Now, this is a horse that's trained by Brad Cox, and the jockey is Luis Saez. This horse, if you remember correctly, was picked and was the favorite to win the Kentucky Derby. Came off and went out of the gate as the betting line favorite. Was 5-0 before that race and never lost a race in its career. Ended up finishing 4th in the Kentucky Derby. Certainly not a bad finish, but finished a little bit further back than people obviously had anticipated. Great pedigree and experience if you ignore the Derby. And as I said, even the Derby was not the worst of all races. Now, the most important thing for Essential Quality, skip the Preakness. So is very fresh, and Bourbonic also skipped the Preakness. So these are horses that are a little bit more fresh compared to those horses that I'm going to get to in a second who might have run at the Preakness just 3 weeks ago. So you had a little bit more time off, a little bit more time to recuperate, train, and get planned up for the Belmont. So distance is certainly a question with all of these horses. Again, none of them really been pushed to this length before. So we'll see. But Essential Quality is coming off at a 2-1 odds and is currently the betting line favorite. And I think there's a good reason for that. There's a lot to like in this horse. Again, same things that you liked going into the Kentucky Derby, you like again. This is a horse that has never lost before the Derby. This is a horse that typically wins pretty comfortably, doesn't ever look gassed either. This is a horse that does not look exhausted when it crosses the finish line, which gives you reason to think this is a horse that can go 1.5 miles and be competitive at that distance. We will see Luis Saez, very experienced jockey, has certainly jockeyed horses at the Belmont before, and so very familiar with when to potentially push a horse in that space. So let's go to the number 3 horse, Rombauer, going off at 3-1. Quite a difference a few weeks makes. Rombauer, of course, was a long shot and ended up winning the Preakness, trained by Michael McCarthy, who I should note is a protege of Todd Pletcher. Why is that important? Because of what I just mentioned, the way Pletcher trains his horses to run a little bit longer and to kind of go that distance and to get them trained up for 1.5 miles. So McCarthy would have watched and been a part of Pletcher's training regimen while he was working with him for all those years. Additionally, his jockey is John Velasquez, who is not his jockey at the Preakness, actually. We're going to get to that in a second, but Velasquez now is on Rombauer, and John Velasquez has won the Belmont twice. So this is a Belmont winning jockey on a trainer who knows how to train horses for a longer distance. He won the Preakness, now setting up for the Belmont. That said, I don't love Rombauer in this particular race. I just don't think the Belmont sets up great for him. First of all, he's only coming off 3 weeks rest. Some of these other horses that we're going to talk about are coming off of 7 weeks rest, or 5 weeks rest, basically, since the Derby. So a little bit fresher than he is. The other thing is what I mentioned at the very beginning of the podcast, which is these are horses that come off of the lead, that come from behind. Belmont doesn't typically set up well for them. Rombauer is not expected to be a horse that's going to be setting the pace. Rombauer is going to be off the pace and then is going to have that late push. It's tougher to have that late push when it's 1.5 miles. There's not much gas left in the tank. There's not much left. There's not another gear necessarily left to go to. So those horses that are come from behind horses, you struggle sometimes in the Belmont. So there are some tactical things I don't love about Rombauer. I do love the connections. The jockey and the trainer, both great. Obviously, the horse might be peaking. This is a horse that seems to be getting better every time out. So, there are some positive signs there. At 3-1, he's not the odds-on favorite. I'll be interested to see where those odds go by post time. If they go up a little bit, maybe. I don't know. Rombauer is certainly a horse that you have to take seriously, but I would not have him on some of my bets this week. I like the horse, but just not that much. Let's move to the number 4 horse, Hot Rod Charlie, coming out at 7-2, and trained by Doug O'Neill. The jockey is Flavien Prat. Now, remember, I mentioned Rombauer has a new jockey. This is why. Flavien Prat, who rode Rombauer at the Preakness, is now riding Hot Rod Charlie because he promised to ride this horse. You have to understand, jockeys ride a lot of different horses, and top of the line jockeys, as someone like Flavien Prat is, or John Velasquez, or any number of these jockeys that we talk about today, they are all being courted by several different trainers to jockey their particular horse. So you do have these instances where jockeys promise themselves to certain horses, not knowing if another horse that they may have jockeyed is going to end up being in the race. I'm sure that was the case. I'm sure that Flavien Prat didn't necessarily think Rombauer was going to be in the Belmont and promised Doug O'Neill to ride Hot Rod Charlie there. And now you have this situation. So Flavien Prat now is riding Hot Rod Charlie, who finished 3rd at the Kentucky Derby, took some time off, obviously, and skipped the Preakness. So a little bit fresher again. And there's a lot to like here. Since Hot Rod Charlie handled the 1.25 miles really well, he looks strong coming down the home stretch. He also doesn't have a style from coming from behind. This was a horse, if you remember the Derby, he got out in that lead pack and was really part of that lead pack the whole way around for the all 1.25 miles. So this is a horse that can get out in front, stay out in front, and be competitive late. So there's a lot to like here at the 9-2 odds, on 7-2 odds. Not bad. I mean, you're not going to make a ton of money on those bets, but pairing Hot Rod Charlie with some other long shots might actually make for some pretty good exacta boxes, and we're going to get to that in a little bit. So let's go to the 5 horse, France Godina, 30-1 long shot. This is the longest shot in the race. Trainer Hideki Mori, jockey Ricardo Santana Jr. This is a horse we spent some time talking about at the Preakness preview. Finished 7th there, did not do particularly well. And if you remember, this is a horse that was imported from Japan and was quarantined actually for several weeks before it could even start training. His previous finish before the Preakness was a 6th place at the United Arab Emirates Derby. It's just, I don't know, not a lot to love here. I don't know what they're thinking in terms of, maybe they just want to bring the horse over to the States and run it, and maybe they get some stabling fees and some stud fees because of it. I don't know. I don't think he's not a live long shot, as I would say. Not a lot to like there. Hasn't really shown me much, particularly at this distance. And you know, if you're looking for a reason to put $2 on a long shot, you could say, well, the horse has now been here in the United States for a little bit longer. Yes, he's run and he might not be as fresh, but maybe he's just acclimated to the new environment a little bit better. And this time around, you're going to see his best effort. Maybe. But that's a big if, in my opinion. So I don't see France Godina as being a very important horse in this race in terms of keeping track of where he goes. So let's move to the 6 horse Known Agenda, coming off at 6-1. This is another Todd Pletcher horse, and this is jockeyed by Irad Ortiz Jr., who jockeyed Midnight Bourbon to a 2nd place finish at the Preakness. Additionally, it should be pointed out that Irad Ortiz Jr. is a New York jockey. He runs a lot at Saratoga, also runs at Belmont, so very familiar with the race. Known Agenda was the Florida Derby winner, and he was my pick to win the Kentucky Derby. And then he promptly finished 9th. Now, there are some things I still really like about Known Agenda. I like that he won at Gulfstream Park by 11 lengths. I like that he pulled away at the Florida Derby. That's always a good sign when you're pulling away coming down the stretch and you're not losing ground. It means going that extra distance might not be a problem. I like the training in terms of Pletcher, knowing how to train horses for this race. And you know from the last preview, I love the jockey. Love Irad Ortiz Jr. The other thing that's important to point out is Known Agenda does not have great tactical speed. And I talked about this in the Kentucky Derby recap during the Preakness preview, that's what kind of doomed him at the Derby. Didn't have that tactical speed to get out in front early. What Known Agenda does have is a really high, I guess you could call it cruising speed. When he's on cruise control, he's just faster than a lot of other horses. But he doesn't necessarily have that additional push. He's not a come from behind horse either. So when he got really far behind in the Derby, it was kind of over before it started in a lot of ways. All of those things, which are negatives on some track, suddenly don't look like negatives in my eyes here. He's also, he's not going to have an issue in terms of being crunched inside. He's going to start at the 6th spot, which is perfectly fine in this race. So there's a lot I like here with Known Agenda. I actually really like this horse in this race. I think there's some positives here. And I also think it's important to look at the price, 6-1. He's not one of these favorites that are basically going off at close to even odds at 2-1 or 3-1. So you're getting a little bit better of a return on bets here for Known Agenda. And I like that. Now, again, I like the connections. But we'll talk about where he fits in my bets here in a moment. Let's go to the number 7 horse, Rock Your World, which is trained by John Sadler and jockeyed by Joel Rosario. Great jockey. And going off at 9-2 odds. Rock Your World finished 17th at the Derby. So this is a horse that maybe needed a break and needed some time off. Now, that said, this was a horse that had beaten Medina's Spirit at the races leading up to the Kentucky Derby. So this is a horse that beat the Derby winner. So you got to like some of this pedigree here. This was a horse that was moving in the right direction and had the only race it lost was the race at the Kentucky Derby. So it did not race as a 2-year-old, though. So very lightly raced horse. Unlike Known Agenda that now this will be its 7th race. I believe this will only be the 5th race for Rock Your World. So fewer races. Like I said, didn't race at all as a 2-year-old. So it'll be interesting to see how Rock Your World bounces back. If you're looking for a reason to bet on this horse, its sire is Constitution. Now, why is that important? Well, Constitution also sired last year's Belmont winner, Tiz the Law, which was a great New York horse, really ran beautifully up at Saratoga as a 3-year-old. Liked a lot of things about that horse last year. But the other thing that's important to note is that last year's Belmont was not run at 1.5 miles. So you go, oh, well, maybe he's bred to go long distances. Well, I don't know. Tiz the Law, yes, won the Belmont, but the Belmont was shorter then. And so this idea that, well, he was the son of Constitution, maybe this means that he's going to be able to go that 1.5 miles. Maybe. We'll see. I mean, again, was the Derby just a hiccup? Was it just a bad ride? Is this horse kind of growing into its own? Is still learning how to race a little bit, having not raced as a 2-year-old? I don't love the 9-2 odds. I mean, those are really low odds for a horse that finished so poorly at the Derby against elite competition and now is coming back against elite competition 5 weeks later. I don't know why we're expecting a dramatically different result in a granted much smaller field, but certainly a horse to keep in mind. And let's then move to the final horse, which is Overtook, which is going off at 20-1 odds, trained by Todd Pletcher, jockeyed by Manny Franco, who won the Belmont last year with Tiz the Law. This is a horse that only has won one time in its maiden race, in its first race, and has finished in the money in second or third 3 other times. Sired by Curlin, so certainly an impressive pedigree from that standpoint. Hard running closer, and that's kind of the MO on this horse. That this horse makes up a lot of ground at the end. I don't love that makeup, obviously, for this particular race. Again, because of Pletcher, is it worth a shot? Maybe, but I just don't like the MO of this horse, and I would rather take a long shot with Bourbonic than I would with Overlook in terms of looking at a Todd Pletcher horse that might be going off at slightly longer odds. I would go with Bourbonic there instead of Overtook. So those are the 8 horses, and now it is time for predictions. Enough of me singing and talking about things. So, as I will always mention, when it comes time for betting, it's about finding value. I will never forget, hitting my very first trifecta years ago at the Florida Derby. And I was all excited. And then I realized I had just bet on the 3 biggest front runners and the lowest odds. And I hit a trifecta box and I thought, oh, I'm rich. I $2 trifecta box. How often do you hit that? Well, I hit it and I made a whopping $18 because all the horses, the three favorite horses were the ones that finished first, second, and third. So you don't make a lot of money when you just bet on the betting line favorites. So part of, placing bets in horse racing is about finding value. And I think that's an important distinction to make. Listen, a lot of these horses, Essential Quality, Hot Rod Charlie, maybe even Rock Your World, certainly Rombauer, all are very good horses. But I don't necessarily love the odds on all of them. So what I would say is if you're building out a trifecta, I would definitely take Known Agenda. Make sure that is in your trifecta because at 6-1 odds, I just like Known Agenda finishing in the top three no matter what. I would also probably take either Hot Rod Charlie or Essential Quality. For this purpose, I would actually pair Known Agenda with Hot Rod Charlie, and then I would take a flyer on Bourbonic as my trifecta. That would really pay off pretty nicely compared to some other trifectas in the field. So again, if you're looking for value that might hit a trifecta box with Known Agenda, Hot Rod Charlie, and Bourbonic, I kind of like that mix. If I was going with an exacta, I don't necessarily love any of the long shots. As much as I say take a flyer with Bourbonic, that's more for a trifecta or a superfecta. I would say, honestly, just pair Known Agenda with like Hot Rod Charlie or Essential Quality. If you're looking, if you go, I'm going to take the betting line favorite, something like Essential Quality, pair it with Known Agenda, you'll make a little bit of money on that if that hits with an exacta box. But yeah, so that's kind of where we're at. I don't love a lot of these long shots, and I think there's probably 4 or 5 horses that are really closely grouped together, both from a betting odds standpoint and just from a quality standpoint. So with all of that said, let's get down to who I think is going to win the 2021 Belmont Stakes, and that is, drum roll please, Known Agenda. Listen, I love Florida. I love the Florida Derby. I like this horse going into the Kentucky Derby. Promptly finished 9th. I'm not giving up on this horse. I like Known Agenda. I like its connections. As I mentioned, I love the trainer. And as you know from last time, I love the jockey. And you tell me that Todd Pletcher and Irad Ortiz Jr. was on a horse, I'm betting on that horse. I just will. I don't need to see anything else about that horse. I know those two names are connected with the horse. I'm putting money on it. And that's exactly what I'm doing with Known Agenda. And on top of that, Known Agenda's got a great pedigree. It's a good horse. Really, really like this horse. And I think this is a race that will shake out with a lot of horses in contention. And I just think Known Agenda has that high cruising speed, doesn't need to come from behind, and with a smaller field is going to be able to get out in front or close to the lead the whole way. And I see Known Agenda pulling away down the stretch for the win. So I hope you enjoyed listening. And listen, what I'll tell you to do this weekend is enjoy listening to Frank Sinatra, enjoy drinking a Belmont Breeze, and maybe even eating a slice of New York pizza or cheesecake for me. I know I'll be going for the cheesecake. Now, I hope you enjoyed this episode of Amalfi Sports at the Belmont Stakes, and make sure to check out all of the great content at Amalfi Media and subscribe to our YouTube feed by going to our website at amalfimedia.com or just by pressing that subscribe button here on YouTube. And you can find out more information on all of our shows on the website. So until the Breeders' Cup, I'm Matthew DeSantis, and it's now post time.